Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Tuesday, February 24th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. Expect a high of 79.2 degrees in Riverside today, with a low dipping to 56.7 degrees, so it's a mild one that calls for light layers and enjoying some outdoor time. Coming up on the show, we'll examine how the White House is scrambling to revive Donald Trump's expansive tariff policies and break down the hurdles hitting California's ambitious push for heat pumps amid soaring electricity prices. Plus, we'll cover other key developments from around the world, including updates on global tech innovations and local community impacts. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. This morning, we're looking at what happens when the Supreme Court blows up a president's tariff plan and Washington tries to rebuild it overnight. Reporter Ethan Hull is with us. Ethan, start us off. What exactly did the court do last Friday?
Last Friday, February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that President Trump could not use a 70s-era emergency law to impose his global tariffs. According to SCOTUS blog, the justices said the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, lets presidents regulate cross-border flows, but not treat tariffs like a tax, without Congress saying so very clearly. That immediately killed the administration's big so-called Liberation Day tariffs, the fentanyl-related tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada, and a lot of other IEEPA-based duties. In one stroke, the court yanked away the legal foundation of Trump's entire emergency tariff regime.
So this wasn't just a technical loss, it sounds bigger than that. How did the justices explain the ruling?
Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that tariffs are fundamentally a tax, and the Constitution gives taxing power to Congress unless Congress expressly hands some of it over, which it had not clearly done here. Legal analysts told SCOTUS blog the decision fits the court's broader major questions approach. If a policy has huge economic and political stakes, like hundreds of billions in duties, Congress has to speak unmistakably. Justice Neil Gorsuch drove home the point by saying, quote, "Most major decisions affecting the duty to pay taxes and tariffs are funneled through the legislative process for a reason," end quote. 3 conservative justices, Brett Kavanaugh, Clarence Thomas, and Samuel Alito, dissented, which commentators at the New York Times and elsewhere describe as a serious split inside the court's conservative bloc.
Given that split, how significant are people saying this decision is for presidential power, beyond trade?
Conservative columnist David French wrote in the New York Times that this may end up being one of the most important decisions of the century, because it proves the court will rein in a president from its own ideological camp. It tells future presidents they cannot stretch open-ended emergency laws to do Congress's taxing work, especially in areas like trade that hit every household. SCOTUS blog's roundup notes that it also bolsters the court's independence at a moment when public trust has been shaky. But that legal principle has now collided with the reality that Trump still wants high tariffs and is racing to replace what the court struck down.
Let's talk about that collision. How big a financial hole did this ruling blow in the tariff system?
Pretty big. Fortune reports, in coverage picked up by SCOTUS blog, that the now illegal IEEPA tariffs had brought in somewhere between $130 billion and more than $160 billion. All of that revenue is now in question, and businesses are eyeing it as possible refunds. At the same time, the White House was suddenly staring at a political defeat and a budget gap, which is why they pivoted so fast to new legal tools.
What did that pivot look like in the hours right after the ruling came down?
According to the Wall Street Journal, Trump got the news in a closed-door meeting with governors, read a note, and asked, quote, "So it is a loss then," end quote. He reportedly told them he was seething inside, called the ruling a disgrace, and cut the meeting short. NBC News quoted aides saying everyone in the building was irate. Within about 3 hours, as SCOTUS blog's media roundup notes, the president was at the cameras announcing a brand new global tariff program, saying he would now lean on, quote, "other legal authorities," end quote, that Congress had given him.
And that brings us to this obscure tool everyone's suddenly talking about, Section 122. What is it, and how is he using it?
Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 lets a president slap a temporary surcharge up to 15% on imports if the United States faces a serious balance of payments problem or a threatened dive in the dollar. It is capped at 150 days unless Congress votes to extend it, and the statute says it should be broad and uniform, meaning global rather than just a few countries. According to the Associated Press and SCOTUS blog, no president had ever actually used it before now. It was written in a world of fixed exchange rates and old-style currency crises. The day after the ruling, Trump said he would use Section 122 to impose a 10% global tariff immediately, and soon after, said he intended to push that up to the full 15%.
As of this morning, February 24th, how much of that plan is actually in effect?
Trade reporters say that as of just after midnight today, Customs and Border Protection has stopped collecting the old IEEPA tariffs and started collecting a 10% surcharge under Section 122. Economists quoted in the briefs say markets are already pricing in an effective rate more like 13 to 14%, assuming Trump does finalize the move to 15% soon. But according to analysts following the Federal Register, there still was no formal order locking in that higher rate earlier today, which is creating confusion at the ports and in corporate planning offices. And by law, that surcharge disappears in late July unless Congress affirmatively votes to keep it, something Capitol Hill reporters describe as politically unlikely in a divided Congress.
So Section 122 is the quick bandage, but the White House has mentioned other laws too. What else is in their toolkit now?
Two of the big ones are Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Law and Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. Section 301 lets the U.S. Trade Representative hit specific countries or products with tariffs after finding, through an investigation, that they engage in unfair or discriminatory practices, usually for a period of about 4 years. Section 232 allows tariffs where imports threaten national security, and that is what Trump used for the earlier steel and aluminum duties, which this case did not touch. According to the Associated Press and KFF Health News, the administration is looking to stack those more targeted tariffs on top of the broad Section 122 surcharge to recreate or even exceed the old IEEPA-era tariff wall.
You mentioned the balance of payments language in Section 122. Is there actually a balance of payments crisis right now, or is that contested?
The White House argues there is. They point to a goods trade deficit of about $1.2 trillion last year, a rare negative income balance where we paid more to foreign investors than we earned abroad, and a net international investment position that is roughly negative 90% of our gross domestic product. On that basis, Trump and his advisors say we face, quote, fundamental international payments problems, end quote, that justify emergency action to keep dollars from flooding overseas. But economists interviewed by the Washington Post and the Peterson Institute, as summarized in the briefs, say this is not what a true balance of payments crisis looks like.
How do those economists define a real balance of payments crisis, and where does the U.S. fall on that spectrum?
A genuine balance of payments or currency crisis happens when a country literally cannot pay for its imports or service its debts because it runs out of reserves, loses access to foreign financing, or sees its currency collapse. The United States, with the world's main reserve currency and deep treasury markets, is nowhere near that, and the International Monetary Fund's own teaching materials emphasize that in a floating exchange rate system, the overall balance of payments always balances through changes in capital flows and the exchange rate. So many legal scholars are calling this a relabeling exercise, taking a chronic trade deficit and branding it an emergency to keep tariffs high after the court closed the IEEPA door. That is why SCOTUS blog's linked commentaries predict fresh lawsuits arguing that Trump is stretching Section 122 well beyond what Congress ever intended.
Let's go back to that pile of money you mentioned earlier. With $130 to maybe $175 billion in now illegal tariffs collected, what happens to that cash?
Forbes and Fortune, in reporting aggregated by SCOTUS blog, say importers are already lining up for refunds on at least $130 billion, possibly as high as about $175 billion, depending on what is counted. The Supreme Court did not spell out refund mechanics in its opinion, so it kicked that issue down to the Court of International Trade and other lower courts. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told Fox News, as Fortune recounted, that the administration will, quote, wait for lower courts to provide instructions, end quote, before acting. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNN he would not get ahead of the courts, warning that detailed guidance could be weeks or even months away.
So businesses cannot just expect a check in the mail next week. How messy could this refund process get?
Trade lawyers quoted in SCOTUS blog's coverage say there is no simple, automatic mechanism for undoing tariffs that later turn out to be unlawful. Customs does not have a special refund machine ready for thousands of complex claims on this scale. Importers are being told to file protests on their entries within about 6 months of final customs liquidation, just to preserve their rights while the Court of International Trade figures out a framework. Several experts told business outlets that fully unwinding these duties could take a year or more, unless Congress steps in.
And Congress is at least trying to step in on refunds, right? Tell us about that bill that just dropped.
Yes, on February 23rd, so just yesterday, Democratic Senators Alex Padilla, Ron Wyden, and Ed Markey introduced the Tariff Refund Act of 2026. According to legislative coverage in the briefs, it would require Customs to return all unlawfully collected IEEPA tariffs, with interest, within 180 days of the bill becoming law. It also tells the agency to prioritize small businesses and manufacturers, out of concern that only the biggest corporations will have the lawyers and systems to jump to the front of the line. The sponsors frame it as both economic relief and a way for Congress to reassert that if tariffs are a tax, then Congress gets to decide who bears it.
In the meantime, companies still have to run their businesses. What are you hearing from them about this sudden switch from one tariff regime to another?
NPR's Morning Edition today described it as a planning nightmare. Firms do not know exactly which products will be hit under the new stack of laws, when the global surcharge might rise from 10 to 15%, or how long any of it will last, given the 150-day clock on Section 122. That affects everything from how they price goods and write contracts, to where they source components and how much inventory they dare to hold. And because supply chains are international, this uncertainty is rippling to foreign suppliers who ship into the U.S. as well.
There has been talk of a refund rally in the markets. Did Wall Street cheer this ruling or get spooked by what followed?
Initially, markets cheered. As news of potential refunds for more than $160 billion in duties spread, stocks of big import-heavy companies, like major retailers and electronics makers, jumped on hopes of lower costs and retroactive windfalls. But as analysts realized that a new 10, maybe 15% global surcharge was coming in to replace a lot of that, and that refunds would be slow and litigious, that rally faded. Outlets like Retail Dive and Forbes, cited in the briefs, now warn that some sectors may end up facing even higher effective tariffs once all the stacking is done.
Which sectors are looking relatively better, and which ones may get hammered under this new setup?
According to trade reporters, consumer electronics and apparel had been facing combined rates around 35% under the old IEEPA structure. Under a 10 to 15% global surcharge, plus whatever targeted measures remain, they may see somewhat lower overall rates, at least for a few months. Steel, aluminum, and autos are in the opposite position. They are still under separate Section 232 national security tariffs that never went away. If you now layer a global Section 122 surcharge on top, their effective protection and their customers' costs could climb above the previous system.
There is also that twist with prescription drugs, where tariffs are tied to prices. How does this ruling affect Trump's leverage over pharma?
Health policy outlets like KFF Health News point out that the administration has been using tariff threats as a stick to push its so-called most favored nation drug pricing policy, where U.S. prices are pegged to the lowest prices offered abroad. The idea has been that if drug makers do not cooperate, the White House could threaten tariffs on imported pharmaceuticals. The Supreme Court closing the IEEPA path does not end that leverage because the same alternative laws, like Section 122, Section 301, Section 232, and even Section 338 of the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Act, can be repurposed to target drugs. KFF Health News concludes the ruling is more a legal rerouting for pharma strategy than a rollback.
Of course, the rest of the world is watching this closely. How are allies and rivals reacting to the U.S. just switching legal labels on its tariffs?
European officials, according to reporting summarized from Brussels and Chatham House, see this as a shell game. The legal footing changes, but the economic effect is still a big unilateral surcharge. The European Commission has reportedly paused ratification of a new US-EU deal until it figures out whether a 10 to 15% blanket tariff violates earlier zero-tariff understandings, and they are openly talking about World Trade Organization challenges or retaliation. China has called the new measures unilateral and protectionist, according to the Associated Press and The Guardian, and hinted at its own retaliatory tariffs if Section 122 is not rolled back. Canada and Mexico, under the USMCA, say they are now living with what they call policy whiplash, as sectoral national security or unfair trade tariffs get stacked on top of whatever baseline rate applies.
Does that uncertainty extend beyond the big three trading partners?
It does. Reporting from Asia, cited in the briefs, says countries like Malaysia and Indonesia are delaying new trade and investment commitments with Washington, pointing to what they describe as American tariff chaos. Analysts at Global Trade Alert and Chatham House argue this is a paradox. On paper, the Supreme Court just stood up for rules, for separation of powers, and for statutory clarity. But because the administration responded with a rapid legal pivot, rather than a policy rethink, allies now see U.S. trade policy as even more volatile and unilateral. That perception could outlast this particular White House.
Let's turn back to Congress. How is Capitol Hill responding beyond the refund bill you mentioned?
Congress is really split between two instincts. One camp, including key Democrats on the Senate Finance and House Ways and Means committees, is talking about a Congressional Trade Authority Act that would force any broad tariffs under Section 232 or Section 122 to come before Congress for a fast up or down vote if they are going to last. That would mirror the court's message presidents cannot run long-term economic policy on old emergency statutes without legislators signing off. At the same time, the House has been voting on resolutions of disapproval that signal lawmakers are very unlikely to extend Trump's new surcharge beyond that 150-day window.
And the other camp, the Trump-aligned Republicans, seem to want to lock his tariff world into law. What would that look like?
One proposal, the Fair Trade Act of 2026, from Republican Representative Beth Van Duyne, would create a permanent 15% baseline tariff on imports from countries with which we run deficits, and 10% on others. That would essentially codify a global tariff floor into statute, taking it out of the emergency zone entirely. Another bill, the U.S. Reciprocal Trade Act, reintroduced by Representative Riley Moore, would let presidents match whatever tariffs other countries impose on us, a kind of automatic mirror tariff authority. And House Budget Chair Jody Arrington, along with Senator Bernie Moreno, is exploring whether they can tuck some of this tariff codification into a budget reconciliation bill, which would only need a simple majority in the Senate.
How do legal and economic experts view those efforts compared with the current Section 122 workaround?
Legal scholars, including former acting Solicitor General Neil Katyal, told SCOTUS Blog and other outlets that using Section 122 as a de facto permanent global tariff law is on very shaky ground. It was built for genuine balance of payments emergencies in a different monetary system, not for long-term management of trade deficits, and the court's major questions reasoning suggests judges will be suspicious of that kind of repurposing. Ironically, if Congress clearly writes a 15% global tariff into ordinary law, that would likely satisfy the court's demand for explicit authorization, even if economists hate it. Those economists, including at Yale's Budget Lab, estimate that keeping average tariffs in the low teens range could raise unemployment by roughly a third of a percentage point by year's end and cost the typical household $600 to $800 a year in higher prices and lower income before any foreign retaliation.
Big legal stakes, big pocketbook stakes. Stepping back, what does this episode tell us about emergency powers and the Supreme Court's direction?
It reinforces a trend we have seen in other areas. The court is tired of presidents and agencies finding sweeping new powers in old, vague statutes. In trade, that means IEEPA can no longer be a backdoor tariff law, and other emergency-flavored provisions like Section 122 are now under a brighter spotlight. Commentators in the New York Times and on SCOTUS blog say this is part of a broader revolt against government by perpetual emergency, where Congress has been sidelined for decades. For future presidents of either party, the signal is that if you want to reshape big chunks of the economy, you need Congress on the record.
And inside the court itself, what does the lineup in this case suggest?
The majority here included Chief Justice Roberts and Justices Gorsuch and Barrett joining the three liberals, while Justices Kavanaugh, Thomas, and Alito dissented. That undercuts the idea of a rigid partisan court that always backs the president from its perceived team. David French argued that this kind of independence, especially in a case that deeply frustrates a Republican White House, may actually restore some public confidence in the institution. It has also drawn intense fire from Trump himself, who, as NBC News and Politico note, has called some of his own appointees disloyal or an embarrassment over this ruling.
Bottom line, Ethan, as of this morning, where does all of this leave businesses, lawmakers, and trading partners?
As of today, the IEEPA tariffs are dead for good, and the court has reasserted that Congress owns tariff power in principle. In practice, though, companies are now paying a new 10% global surcharge under Section 122, bracing for a possible jump to 15%, and navigating sector-specific tariffs under other laws that the court did not disturb. Importers may eventually claw back somewhere between $130 and $175 billion, but only after a long slog through the Court of International Trade, or if Congress forces faster refunds. Abroad, allies see a legal shell game more than a policy change. And at home, Congress is split between putting the tariff genie back in the bottle or writing it into the statute books, all under the watchful eye of a Supreme Court that has clearly signaled it is not done policing the boundaries of presidential power.
A lot of moving pieces, and it affects everything from prices at the store to America's role in the global economy. Ethan Hall, thanks for breaking it down for us.
Thanks for having me, Grace.
California has big climate plans built around heat pumps, but also some of the priciest electricity in the country. Reporter Chloe Martinez is here to untangle that tension. Chloe, what's the basic conundrum here?
The short version is California is betting on a very efficient electric appliance, but it's plugging that appliance into a very expensive grid. LAist and CalMatters reported yesterday that the state wants millions of homes to switch from gas heat to electric heat pumps by 2030. But the more you rely on electricity in much of California, the higher your bill can climb, even with efficient gear. That's the heart of what they're calling the heat pump conundrum.
Let's start with the ambition. How central are heat pumps to California's climate strategy?
They are absolutely central. State policy calls for about 6 million residential heat pumps by 2030, and CalMatters describes that as, quote, one of the most aggressive heat pump strategies in the country, end quote. The idea is to phase out natural gas furnaces, water heaters, and stoves, and push buildings onto the electric grid. Regulators at the Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission see that as essential to cutting emissions from homes and businesses.
Why focus so much on buildings? Aren't cars the bigger problem?
Transportation is huge, but buildings are not small. EPA data cited by CalMatters show direct fossil fuel use in buildings. Things like space heating, water heating, and cooking make up around 13% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Cars and trucks add another 16%. State agencies argue that if you electrify both sectors together, you get a big slice of overall climate progress.
For listeners who don't live and breathe HVAC, what exactly is a heat pump, and why do experts like it?
A heat pump basically works like a refrigerator in reverse. It moves heat rather than burning fuel to create it, using a refrigerant loop to pull warmth from outside air and bring it indoors. Because of that, it can deliver roughly 3 to 4 units of heat for every unit of electricity it uses, compared with a gas furnace that tops out below 100% efficiency. And it doubles as an air conditioner, which matters more each year as summers get hotter, even in historically mild parts of California.
Nationally, are people actually buying these, or is this still mostly a California thing?
This is very much a national trend. Rocky Mountain Institute, which LAist cites, notes that heat pumps have outsold gas furnaces nationwide every year since 2021. Federal tax credits and rebates from the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act have juiced those sales across the country. So the technology is not niche anymore. It is mainstreaming fast.
If they're so efficient, why are they a financial question mark in California specifically?
In much of the country, a heat pump is a win on your utility bill because electricity is relatively cheap. In California, according to CalMatters and UC Berkeley's Energy Institute at Haas, residential electricity prices are nearly double the national average and have risen much faster than inflation over the past 2 decades. Natural gas here got about 80% more expensive between 2001 and 2024, but electricity prices rose roughly twice that. So even though heat pumps use power efficiently, that power itself is very expensive.
What's driving those sky-high electricity prices beyond just fuel costs?
A lot of it is policy and risk. Utilities are spending billions on wildfire prevention, grid hardening, and paying off past wildfire liabilities, and those costs are baked into everyone's bills. On top of that, as LAist and the Legislative Analyst's Office both highlight, California loads a long list of public purpose and social programs onto electric rates instead of the state budget. Energy economist Lucas Davis at Berkeley argues that each kilowatt hour in California is effectively taxed far above its actual production and delivery cost.
How does that show up in people's decisions about what to use for heat?
Davis's research, cited by CalMatters, shows the relative price of gas versus electricity is the single best predictor of which fuel people choose. Nationally, electric heating is common in the Southeast, where power is cheap. In California, the incentives run the other way. Nearly 2/3 of homes here use natural gas for space heating, versus about half of homes nationwide. So you have a climate law pointing one direction and price signals nudging people in the opposite direction.
Is this just a California perception problem, or do national studies actually show mixed economics here?
National studies see California as a mixed bag. A Harvard team led by Roxana Shafee and Daniel Schrag looked county by county at energy prices, heating needs, and winter temperatures. They found the American South and the Pacific Northwest often see lower bills with heat pumps because winters are mild and electricity is cheap, while parts of the northern Midwest can see higher bills when switching from gas. California, they say, looks technically ideal in many coastal areas, but high electric rates, bigger homes, and colder inland or mountain climates mean outcomes range from small savings to noticeable increases.
So does that mean coastal Californians are in better shape than people inland?
Broadly, yes. Modeling summarized by LAist, RMI, and the Public Advocate's Office at the CPUC finds that in coastal areas served by big investor-owned utilities like PG&E and Southern California Edison, a typical home replacing a gas furnace and older AC with a modern heat pump can save maybe $100 to $300 a year after recent rate changes. That is partly from efficient heating in a mild climate, and partly from more efficient cooling. But in the Central Valley, Sierra foothills, or Inland Empire, studies often show bill-neutral results or increases of a couple $100s a year, because heating and cooling loads are high and each kilowatt hour is still expensive.
What about customers of public utilities like SMUD or LADWP, where bills are usually lower?
That's where heat pumps look closest to a slam dunk. Municipal utilities like SMUD in Sacramento or LADWP in Los Angeles generally charge substantially lower rates than the big private utilities. Independent modeling referenced by RMI and state reports suggests homes switching from gas plus standard AC to heat pumps in those territories can save on the order of $500 to $800 a year. For those customers, the national narrative of heat pumps as a clear financial win largely holds.
Faced with that price problem, lawmakers passed AB 205. What was that supposed to fix?
Assembly Bill 205 tried to make each extra kilowatt hour cheaper, so running a heat pump or charging an electric car would be more affordable. It ordered the Public Utilities Commission to create income-graduated fixed charges on monthly bills, and then use that money to cut the per kilowatt-hour rate. So you now have a higher flat monthly fee, especially for middle and higher income customers, and a lower usage charge. The idea, according to coverage in CalMatters and Utility Dive, was to move some fixed grid and wildfire costs into that monthly charge and encourage electrification with lower marginal rates.
What do those new fixed charges look like in practice?
For most standard residential customers of PG&E, Edison, or SDG&E, the new fixed charge is about $24.15 a month. Moderate-income customers on the FARA program pay around $12, and low-income customers on CARE pay about $6. In exchange, per kilowatt-hour charges fall by roughly 5 to 7 cents, which is an 8 to 18% cut depending on the utility. Those changes rolled out for Edison and SDG&E late last year and for PG&E early this year.
Has that actually made running a heat pump noticeably cheaper?
It helps, but not dramatically. The Energy Institute at Haas, including economist Severin Borenstein, estimates the real marginal cost of supplying an extra kilowatt-hour is around 12 to 15 cents. Even after the cut, residential rates in those big utility territories still hover between roughly 35 and 45 cents per kilowatt-hour. So as Haas and the Utility Reform Network both argue, AB 205 nudged prices in the right direction but did not come close to aligning them with actual costs.
How are consumer advocates reacting, especially to that flat monthly fee?
Advocates are split. TURN acknowledges the income-graduated structure and lower per kilowatt-hour rates genuinely help low-income CARE and FARA customers who use more electricity, which is important for equity. But TURN's Matthew Friedman argues that for many middle-income households, that roughly $24 fixed charge soaks up much of the benefit from cheaper usage, and it feels like a tax on conservation because you owe it no matter how efficient or frugal you are. Solar advocates add that it erodes savings for people who invested in rooftop solar.
Let's talk about real bills. After AB 205, what does this look like for a typical coastal homeowner thinking about a heat pump?
LAist and RMI's modeling suggest that, before the change, coastal homes replacing a gas furnace plus a 10 to 15-year-old AC with a modern heat pump were often roughly break-even on annual bills, maybe slight savings. After the 5 to 7 cent per kilowatt-hour cut, those same homes now tend to see modest savings, on the order of $10 to $30 a month. Over a year, that can be $100 to $300. That assumes they are using the heat pump for both heating and cooling, and that the old AC was relatively inefficient.
And for someone in, say, Fresno or Riverside, does the math look different?
It does. In the Central Valley or Inland Empire, heating needs are bigger in winter, and cooling loads can be brutal in summer. Studies summarized by Inside Climate News and the Haas blog show that even after AB 205, many inland households going from gas to heat pumps see bills that are flat at best and often higher by maybe $15 to $50 a month if they do not have rooftop solar. In those areas, the efficiency gains do not fully overcome the high price of each unit of electricity.
Upfront costs are another hurdle. How expensive is it to install one of these systems?
It can be a shock. Reporting from LAist and Capital Weekly's Roundup says a whole house heat pump system, professionally installed, can easily run into the low tens of thousands of dollars, and in bigger or older homes can reach $20,000 to $30,000 or more. Advocates like Madison Vanderclay from the Building Decarbonization Coalition argue that when you remember it is replacing both a furnace and an AC, the extra or incremental cost can be modest or even zero once rebates kick in. But many homeowners only see the big invoice.
And that's just the equipment. What about the electrical work we keep hearing about?
That is the ugly surprise in a lot of projects. TURN points out that panel upgrades from 100 amps to 200 amps, New wiring runs, and sometimes even upgrades to the utility service line can add several $1,000s. If you are also planning a heat pump water heater, an induction stove, and an electric car charger, those costs multiply. That makes people understandably nervous about whether future bill savings will ever pay back all that investment.
Incentives are supposed to cushion that blow. What help is actually out there right now?
Quite a bit, especially since the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. There is a federal tax credit worth up to $2,000 for qualifying heat pumps, and a separate federal rebate program called HEEHRA that can cover up to $8,000 for low-income households and $4,000 for moderate-income ones. State programs like TechClean California and a newer Equitable Building Decarbonization Initiative layer on top of that, sometimes paying for the entire heat pump and installation in low-income or environmental justice communities. Analysts quoted by Inside Climate News say those combined incentives can erase the extra upfront cost of choosing a heat pump over a standard gas and AC replacement for many households.
Are there efforts to make installation itself simpler or cheaper, beyond just handing out rebates?
Yes, regulators are trying to chip away at soft costs too. The CPUC has approved more than $100 million in market transformation efforts, including promoting 120-volt plug-in room heat pumps that use standard outlets and can avoid pricey panel upgrades. On the legislative side, Senator Scott Wiener's so-called Heat Pump Access Act, SB 222, aims to streamline local permitting so people are not stuck in months of paperwork. And Assemblymember Mark Berman's AB 2313 would offer cash to electrify a home at the exact moment a gas utility would otherwise spend money on replacing an aging gas line.
You mentioned equity concerns around AB 205. How are environmental justice groups viewing all this?
Many are worried the new rate design still asks too much from lower and moderate income households that use relatively little energy. Groups like the California Environmental Justice Alliance and the Solar Rights Alliance argue that a large fixed charge punishes people who have conserved or invested in efficiency and rooftop solar, because a bigger slice of their bill is now unavoidable. They also stress, as the Legislative Analyst's Office did in a 2025 report, that high electricity prices could undercut public support for climate policy if people feel they are paying more each month with no clear benefit. Some lawmakers are already talking about capping fixed charges for ultra-efficient or all-electric homes, and shifting more wildfire costs onto the state's general fund.
Beyond today's bills, there's also talk about a long-term gas death spiral. What does that mean?
It is a warning about what happens if more and more people leave the gas system, but the pipes and maintenance costs stay. Independent modeling by firms like E3 and GridWorks, cited by CalMatters and Inside Climate News, suggests that if utilities keep repairing and expanding gas infrastructure for a shrinking customer base, the cost per remaining customer could soar. Some scenarios show gas delivery charges climbing toward $10 to $15 per therm by around 2040, many times today's levels. That would make sticking with gas very expensive and could make early heat pump adopters look pretty far-sighted in hindsight.
Given all that, how close is California to its 6 million heat pump goal, and are we on pace?
Not yet. A 2025 blueprint from the California Heat Pump Partnership, covered by outlets like Canary Media, estimated the state had about 1.9 million heat pumps installed by then. At roughly 200,000 new units a year, California would miss the 2030 goal by around 2 million. To catch up, installations would need to roughly triple to somewhere between 600,000 and 750,000 a year.
So what's the main bottleneck now, according to the analysts you've been reading?
There's broad agreement that the technology itself is ready, and that incentives have eased the upfront cost problem, especially for low-income households. The real sticking point, everyone from the Legislative Analyst's Office to the Haas energy economists to Turn keeps saying, is confidence in affordable electricity over time. Inland customers served by the big private utilities, in particular, look at their bills and fear that electrifying will make them guinea pigs for a costly experiment. until California decides who really pays for wildfire and social program costs and brings per kilowatt-hour prices closer to underlying costs, heat pumps will remain a cautious, region-by-region decision rather than an automatic yes.
So in one line, what's the tension policymakers still haven't resolved?
California is asking millions of families to bet their home comfort on a grid whose prices and cost structure were built for a different era, and until that mismatch is fixed, the state's climate-driven electrification push will continue to run into kitchen table math.
Big stakes for bills, comfort, and the climate. Chloe Martinez, thanks for walking us through it.
Thanks, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. An investigative storm is clouding the sunshine law around the Jeffrey Epstein files. On February 24, 2026, an NPR review found the Department of Justice has withheld or removed at least 53 pages from the public Epstein database, including FBI interview notes tied to sexual abuse allegations against President Donald Trump. This may clash with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, signed in November 2025, which ordered full disclosure of Epstein-related investigative materials. The Justice Department and Attorney General Pam Bondi insist the gaps are about victim privacy and legal limits, not politics, backing that up in a February 14th letter to Congress. Lawmakers from left and right, including Representatives R.O. Khanna and Thomas Massie, are warning of possible impeachment moves or sanctions against department leaders. Advocates, cited by The Guardian, say millions of documents remain missing even after about 3.5 million pages were released, including records naming high-profile figures. Legal analysts at Democracy Docket argue the clash could test how transparent Washington is willing to be about who orbited Epstein's world. Across the Atlantic, diplomacy is taking a French leave. France has formally clipped the wings of United States Ambassador Charles Kushner, restricting his access to cabinet-level ministers after he skipped a formal summons at the Foreign Ministry. Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, quoted by The Guardian and Agence France-Presse, said Kushner showed an apparent failure to grasp the basic requirements of his post. The meeting was called over United States Embassy social media comments about the death of a far-right activist in Lyon, denounced in Paris as meddling. According to the Associated Press, Kushner is now barred from direct talks with ministers, but may still hold exchanges with ministry officials, effectively downgrading his day-to-day status. It is the second time since his 2025 appointment that he has skipped such a summons after an August no-show, deepening French concerns that the Trump administration is trying to insert itself into debates ahead of the 2027 presidential race. In Panama, the tide has turned at the canal's key gateways. On February 23rd and 24th, the government seized the Balboa and Cristobal ports from Panama Ports Company, a unit of Hong Kong-based C.K. Hutchison Holdings. A final Supreme Court ruling, reported by the Associated Press and Reuters, found the longtime concession unconstitutional because it lacked a public tender and granted disproportionate advantages to the operator. President José Raúl Mulino signed a decree empowering the Panama Maritime Authority to occupy the terminals and take over movable assets, from cranes to software, during an 18-month transition. Control of docks that handle roughly 5% of global trade and about 40% of United States container traffic is shifting to temporary operators APM terminals, linked to Maersk and Mediterranean Shipping Company, while a new tender is prepared. The South China Morning Post notes Beijing and Hong Kong have lodged stern protests, as Washington quietly hails the move as a channel check on Chinese influence. In Brazil, river politics have taken a new course. After 33 days of protests, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's government says it will revoke a 2025 decree that opened the Tapajós, Madeira, and Tocantins rivers to private concessions and industrial dredging. The demonstrations peaked with thousands of indigenous protesters from 14 ethnic groups occupying a Cargill grain terminal in Santarém, halting soy and corn exports, according to Bloomberg. Presidency General Secretary Guilherme Boulos admitted the plan advanced without the constitutionally required free, prior, and informed consultation, Mongabay reports. The Lula administration calls the reversal a victory for democratic dialogue. Indigenous leaders from the Tapajós and Arapians Council call it a historic win for the ecological balance of the world's largest rainforest. The rollback is a major setback for Brazil's national privatization program, which sought to turn rivers into hydro-highways to cut agribusiness costs, and a blow to traders such as Cargill, handling more than 40% of northern grain shipments. Protesters say they will leave the terminal only once the repeal is printed in the official gazette, keeping the pressure current on government promises. And in Mexico, cartel violence is rewriting the playbook for the 2026 World Cup. Following the February 22 killing of Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, a wave of retaliatory attacks has rocked Guadalajara and wider Jalisco. State. The Associated Press and The Guardian report coordinated narco-bloqueos using burning vehicles and shootouts have left at least 70 people dead and forced the indefinite postponement of several Liga MX matches. Reuters and Channel News Asia say FIFA is monitoring the crisis with Mexican authorities as security doubts grow over matches scheduled for Estadio Akron, a planned host venue. Governments including the United States and Canada have issued heightened travel warnings, while Mexican officials keep red alert measures in place to protect infrastructure such as the Guadalajara airport, as detailed by the Washington Post and the Times of India. Analysts warn the power vacuum after El Mencho's death could trigger prolonged turf wars, threatening tourism, team base camps for countries like South Korea and Colombia, and possibly Guadalajara's role on the World Cup stage, turning the beautiful game into a dangerous one. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT 5.1, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.